Christians have a long history of apologetics. Apologetics is the root of the modern word apology. Originally, thousands of years ago, it didn't mean exactly the same thing it means today. Back then, the word meant something like persuasive logic. The objective was that after hearing your apologetic, the other person would now think what you think. This is actually something we do in everyday life all the time. It's normal for us to make points to each other and give evidence and prove to convince other people we are right. We do this in sports, academics, and even with who has to clean the dishes tonight. The Bible actually commands us to do this for our faith in Christ. We are commanded to give people good reasons why we believe what we believe. But the Bible also gives us guidelines on how to go about this. One of the many people's favorite Bible verses is 1 Peter 3:15. Before we take a look at that verse, we need to look at the book of 1 Peter. The book of 1 Peter opens by telling us that it is addressed to a persecuted church. In those days, the Roman government considered being a Christian a crime against the empire. Being a Christian could get you thrown in jail, beaten, or even executed. 1 Peter 3:15 gives us two commands. The first command is, set apart Christ in your hearts as Lord. So this is not a simple suggestion. We are commanded to do this. For the Christians at that time, they were commanded to always remember who is really in charge, regardless of who is throwing them into prison. The second command is, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you. The words, always be prepared, aren't exactly how it was originally written. The Bible was written over 1,000 years before modern English language came into existence. The original word meant something similar to physical fitness. Physical fitness is something you don't keep. Once you've got it, you have to continue exercising. No matter how much you exercise, if you stop exercising, then you'll soon be out of shape. So this command sees itself as a discipline that we may strive to always be strong at. The next words are often translated differently, and some translations say give a defense. Others say give an answer. A more literal translation is give an apologetic. So in an environment where being a Christian will cost you your life, Peter tells us to be ready, willing, and constantly able to explain to people why we believe in Jesus. Notice that Peter doesn't tell us to go around starting arguments and debates about why we are Christians. He assumes that people will ask us why we are Christians. There's a ton we could say about that, but the idea from Peter is that if you set apart Christ as your Lord, then you will soon have people asking why you are so different. The scary question to ask yourself is, why don't people ask me questions about why I am a Christian? We should move on to the next verse for just a second. Peter warns us to give our apologetic with both gentleness and respect. That is absolutely good advice. Now, let's move on to something new. What we want to do is actually give you some reasons why Christianity is true. Please understand that we won't be able to answer all of your questions. When it comes to the proofs for God's existence, everyone has their own unique questions, their own unique struggles. Everyone sees their own special flaws in the proofs. For this reason, apologetics tends to work better one-on-one, where we can deal with each person's questions specifically. Because of this, let me encourage anyone to send me your questions or find someone to ask them to. I really mostly want to whet your appetite for apologetics with this video. If you want to continue reading, listening, and watching, I can recommend for you some good online resources. I think RZIM, BeThinking.org, and Reasonable Faith are great places to start. Some great names to look up might be Ravi Zacharias, William Lane Craig, Michael Ramsden, or John Lennox. For teens, I especially recommend StandToReason.org and the many conferences for teens that they host. First, we're going to take a look at some historical evidences for the resurrection. Did Jesus actually rise from the grave? Did you know that there's actually a ton of evidence that he did? Because we're going to take a look at that evidence, that means there's always going to be a chance that we're wrong. In other words, there's always a chance that Jesus didn't rise from the grave when it comes to evidence-based arguments. Evidence-based arguments make a strong case that it's far more likely that Jesus did rise from the grave than that he did not. That's still a really big deal. And the reason why we're going to look at evidence-based arguments first is because that's how people usually figure out things in everyday life. We're all accustomed to using evidence. And we can actually, but pay attention please, we can actually make stronger arguments than just these evidence arguments for Christianity. We can make arguments that go to beyond just probably true to this has to be true. But these types of proofs take a little bit more thinking. We'll look at one of those types of proofs for God's existence after we look at this evidence argument for the resurrection. So we're going to give you two arguments in this video. Alright? First of all, let's look at this evidence for the resurrection. And the first piece of evidence we're going to start with is a Bible. Everyone has a Bible. Most homes have more than one Bible. So we're all familiar with Bibles. Now, everyone can agree that the Bible clearly exists. So let's ask ourselves a simple question. Did the Bible exist before 1970? Now that's a long time before you were born. So what do you think? You weren't there. So how can you really know? Well, most of you have parents or maybe grandparents who can assure you the Bible definitely existed before 1970. But what if your parents and grandparents are lying to you? I bet every one of you can think of at least one thing that your parents or grandparents have told you that isn't true. So maybe they're lying, right? Here's the real question for you to think about. Would they all tell you the exact same lie? In other words, you could go to all your friends and their parents would all tell you the exact same story, that the Bible's older than 1970. So you begin to ask yourself, did everyone get together in 1970 and have some sort of secret meeting with a secret handshake and agree to make up the Bible? And did they build all these old churches just to make the lie of the Bible and the whole imaginary thing they made up in 1970 called Christianity and the Bible? Did they build all these old churches just to make the lie look true? I think we can all agree that a gigantic conspiracy like that is possible, but it is not likely. In fact, it's pretty ridiculous. And that is exactly how historical evidence works. If you can have multiple independent sources for a story, and they all agree, then it's more likely to be true. The more sources you have, the more likely it is to be true. So in the case of the Bible being older than 1970, we all, right off the top of our head, can come up with tons and tons of sources. Independent, separate sources. Logically, when people make up stories, they don't make up the exact same one. So, we've just learned how historical evidence works. So, good for us, right? Now, we can start to see that the Bible would probably not just be older than 1970, right? But we can extend this further, and we can say it's probably really old. What about those pilgrims who came to America for religious freedom? That's all imaginary? What about all those medieval churches back in Europe? That's all part of the big conspiracy. It's all made up. That seems silly, right? What about the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church, and so much more? It's probably most likely that the Bible's really old. I think we all can agree on that. So now what we want to do is reverse things around. Instead of looking at the Bible on our end, in our hand today, let's go to the other end and let's say, all right, all the way back to Jesus. What about Jesus? Let's say that here's Jesus, and what if Jesus made it up? What if Jesus made up his resurrection? What if Jesus faked it? He faked coming back from the dead. Well, that sounds like a pretty difficult task, but we don't have a giant conspiracy of people, right? Just one guy, okay? All right, so the thing is, we can see pretty quickly, I bet all of you are already thinking that it's pretty hard to fake coming back from the dead, right? I mean, how do you do that? What's more, they saw him crucified and buried. It was a public execution. There were lots of witnesses. They even saw a spear jabbed into Jesus' side to make sure that he was dead. That's only half the problem. How did Jesus convince people that he came back from the dead? Think about it. While the crowds were at the crucifixion, there were crowds there, his closest followers actually abandoned him at the time when he was being executed. But later, his closest followers, they were the witnesses to him coming back from the dead. They were the witnesses to the resurrection. Those guys, the apostles, they were constantly in danger for claiming that Jesus rose from the dead. They didn't just die for it. They all faced death on a regular basis. They didn't just die. They faced death every day, constantly. They were about to die. But because they said Jesus is back from the dead. So how do a bunch of people who deserted Jesus become so convinced that Jesus rose from the dead? In other words, think of it this way. Jesus has been beaten. He hasn't eaten or drank anything for days. No water, no food. He's been buried. He's had multiple stab wounds, some severe stab wounds. And yet we're supposed to believe that this man, let's say that by some fluke chance, he actually survived all this. Would you think that, well, he's defeated death? Or would you think, oh no, Jesus survived, we've got to get him medical care because he's barely alive? I mean, how would he come back and be like, yeah guys, I'm indestructible? Nobody is going to fall for that. Okay? It's just not very likely. Alright? So, again, we've taken a look at two pretty unlikely versions of this. Let's look at it. Alright, that theory is unlikely. What about a different theory? Okay, maybe Jesus was dead. Jesus is dead. He's buried in the tomb. But his followers, his disciples, what if they just made up the story of him coming back from the dead? Okay, so this is a little different. Before, we're just talking about just Jesus. He made up a fake story. Now we're talking about a handful of people conspiring together. They all had to get their story straight and make up a lie together. Now remember what we learned before. The bigger a conspiracy is, the more unlikely it is. But perhaps with this, small group of people, the disciples, maybe it's few enough people that it could work. Maybe they could make up this conspiracy. All right. Now, this is actually the oldest version of what, the opponents to the resurrection. There were people back then who said Jesus didn't rise from the grave, and what they said was the disciples made it up. That's what they said. This is the oldest anti-Christian version of things. The disciples made it up. Nobody argued. There's no historical accounts, or we don't have anything that says where anyone argued that Jesus was still in the grave. So, that what they said is the disciples stole the body. Because, obviously if the disciples say, Jesus is back from the dead, then they whip out the body, it's clear that the disciples are wrong. So, clearly Jesus was dead, clearly the tomb was empty, but what did he resurrect? That's the question. Now, the real question is, what about the disciples? They were suddenly willing to face death on a regular basis because they believed that Jesus had defeated death, because they believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They didn't just die for believing in it. They faced death daily as they carried the story of Jesus across the world. Alright. Now, when a person is willing to die for something, that's a pretty strong indication that that person actually believes it. I mean, they're not doing it for money, and they're not doing it for power. They're willing to die for it. They believe it, right? Okay, so at this point, a lot of people say, well, that doesn't mean that Jesus really rose from the dead, just because the disciples really believe it. I mean, think about like Muslim terrorists today, like the ones at 9/11, right? I mean, they die for, jihad in the name of Muhammad and Allah. But that doesn't mean that Muhammad and Allah is true. Well, that's a very different case. Very, very different. Nobody alive today who dies for what Muhammad wrote over 1,000 years ago knows for sure that the Quran isn't true. In other words, if the disciples were willing to die because they said they witnessed Jesus coming back from the dead, that's different. These hijackers today and suicide bombers today, they didn't witness anything. In other words, we're talking about disciples who are willing to die for something that they themselves made up. You see, a person might be willing to believe something and, still think it's true and be willing to die for it. But it's very different to say that a person made it up and knows it isn't true, but is still willing to die for it. That doesn't make any sense. If you made up the lie, you know it isn't true. And this is the issue that they face in the ancient world with the disciples. These guys claim to witness something and they're willing to die for it. They genuinely saw something. Now at this point, sometimes people get ridiculous. Like some people argue that, well, okay, this is what happened. All the disciples hallucinated. They all had a mass hallucination. They all hallucinated the same thing. I mean, it's commonplace after someone dies close to you, a lot of times people will say that they saw them. Alright, this is ridiculous to say that a mass hallucination happened to explain the story of the disciples and the resurrection. What are the odds that a bunch of people all happen to hallucinate the same thing and then later all believe that it really happened instead of thinking that they might have hallucinated to the point that they're willing to die for it? It's ridiculous. Alright, now there's still another possibility. What if the disciples themselves are made up people? In other words, like, okay, well, it doesn't make sense for the disciples to have existed and lived the life they lived because clearly they believed it and would have made up the lie. So, like, we could say today, well, that was 2,000 years ago. Alright, what if the disciples didn't even exist? What if they're made up? Well, that runs into a different problem. I mean, like, if the stories of the lives of the disciples and how they spread Christianity was all a fake story, now we come back to the giant conspiracy. It's coming back to haunt us, right? I mean, how did a giant movement like Christianity get started by a bunch of imaginary people? Or at least maybe they were real people, but their lives where they started Christianity, that part was made up. I mean, so they're still imaginary people living imaginary lives. Why did the stories of the lives of disciples all agree? In other words, all the accounts, we have lots of accounts, lots of stories. Again, it's just an unlikely that this is a made-up story. The problem is one we looked at before. People don't all make up the same story. And when it comes to the lives of the disciples and the spreading of the early church, there are tons of sources for this. The early church, after the time of the Bible, in other words, the Bible was finished, and then we have, the early days of the church. And the early days of the early Christians after the time of the disciples, they wrote so much about the Bible that you can rebuild the Bible from how much they quoted it. In other words, they quoted all but 11 lines of the Bible. What's more, the Bible is itself a book that spread all over the empire with tons of copies. And there were churches all over the empire spreading the story of the apostles of Jesus Christ. So in other words, it just doesn't make sense. You've got tons and tons of independent sources for this. It would have to be a gigantic conspiracy, and it's ridiculous. So this brings us to the final theory. In other words, all of the theories I've thrown at you, the professors and academics who say that the Bible isn't true, they don't use any of those because they agree that all of those are ridiculous. The disciples are made up. They're like, that's ridiculous. Jesus made it up. They're like, that's ridiculous. All of these different things. The disciples faked it. That's ridiculous. What they claim, this is where the real scholarly debate is today. It's what's called the legendary hypothesis. And so this is where all the debate is today. And this is where the evidence comes down. And a legend is a way that you can have like a fake story, but also have everyone tell the same fake story. It's a way to get past the conspiracy problem. And the idea is that a legend develops over a long period of time. And over that long period of time, people all tell different versions of the story. And over time, people make little changes here and there. Slowly but surely, more popular versions rise up and others are weeded out. Eventually, the final version is chosen by people who lived really a long time after the actual events. So the final version can be very different from the original version, and legends are a way that a story can be fake, but also there can be one story with like multiple independent sources, because all of the sources you have are like a long time after the original events. So it had this long history of being weird and crazy as a legend until it all got concisely shortened, abbreviated, and abridged into the final version. So after a long time, nobody's making up the story anymore. They're all just telling the legend that was taught to them by someone who taught to them, someone who taught to them, someone who taught to them. This is actually where most of the debate is today. As I said, actual scholars and professors debate the idea of whether the Bible is a legend. Now, the question is there evidence that the story of the Bible, the full story of Jesus and especially the resurrection, how old is that story? Can we show that that story existed a long time ago? In other words, did that story exist close to the time of the actual events? Because if it existed as it is today, close to the time of the actual events, then it cannot be a legend. Alright, that would mean that the story of the resurrection was not created slowly over time, but was in existence right away. Alright, here's the thing. There is evidence that the Bible was written soon after the events. So let me give you just some of it. We can't even talk about all of it. First of all, we have no original copies of the Bible with things like, like books of the Bible where, Paul signed it at the end. We have copies of the originals, right? We have thousands of copies from all over the ancient world, and the copies themselves are ancient. Right now, the oldest known copy is from the book of John, and it dates to 150 AD. That's only 120 years after the time of Jesus. It was found in Egypt, which was a long way from Israel. So, in other words, it had made its way all the way down to Egypt, and it's only a copy. So if the copies are old, then the original has to be even older. So we can use the copies to prove that, well, there must be an even older original version of the story, because this is just a copy in like another country. And so 120 years after the event, they already have copies of the story in other countries, which means that the story must be very old, right? Now you say, well, how do we know that this copy really dates to 150 AD? Well, they date it one way they date it is using radiocarbon dating. And to check to see if, in other words, like they look at, to look at the radioactive decay of carbon in the paper, or the papyrus. To check to see if the dating is accurate, they use another method, because handwriting styles also change in little ways over the centuries. So you come up with a date based on little changes to handwriting styles, and you say, this is the handwriting that dates to this time, and then you look at the radiocarbon dating. Both methods come up with the same date, and those are two independent methods of dating it, and if they come up with the same date, you can say, well, that's when it was written. But there's more than that. Most historians agree, for a lot of reasons, that John was probably one of the later books of the Bible to be written. Well, if it's later, then that means the other books of the Bible are even older, even closer to the time of Jesus. So when was John written? Now, think about this. The main point of the New Testament was that Jesus came to be the Lamb of God. In other words, Jesus was crucified and died in our place. Before Jesus, the Jewish temple perform sacrifices to seek the forgiveness of God. So the main point of the New Testament was that Jesus replaced the Jewish temple system of sacrifices, and that the whole Jewish temple thing was now done, and that you needed to move on to trusting in Jesus and God's and the Lamb of God for your forgiveness, and no longer make sacrifices in the temple. God had provided the final lamb. Now this is funny. In the year 70 AD, this is a big major point of history, the Romans attacked Israel. They kicked all the Jews out of Israel. This is called the diaspora. And they destroyed the Jewish temple. The Jews didn't come back to Israel until 1948. So why on earth does the Bible never ever mention the destruction of the temple? For Christians, this would have been like the hand of God proving that they were right. Because they had been persecuted by Jews for claiming that Jesus did away with the purpose of the temple. But people went on sacrificing in the temple until the Romans came and destroyed the temple. The book of Hebrews goes on and on about how the temple's pointless now. Isn't it odd that the Bible never at least mentions it? The most likely explanation is a very simple explanation. It hadn't happened yet. That really makes the most sense. You don't mention it because it hadn't happened yet. And that's just one of the many evidences that the Bible was written early. 70 AD is just 40 years after the time of Jesus. 40 years before today is 1977. Okay? It's not likely that people made up the story of the lives of the apostles in that short of a time, and it was somehow a legend, and yet they all made up the story. You just don't make up a legend in 40 years. You don't have that. This is in the lifetime of the people who were there. It's more likely that the apostles really lived the lives that they did. And that means that they really believed something, because it's not likely that they were willing to die for a lie they made up. And it isn't likely that Jesus tricked them into thinking he died and rose again. The simple fact is, it's much more likely that Jesus actually resurrected. Now, we want to take a look at something different. We've looked at an evidence-based argument, but now we're going to switch our thinking caps and look at something just a little bit different. We're going to look at what's called one of the classical proofs for the existence of God, instead of just looking at the life of Jesus. Instead of using evidence, now we're going to use purely logical reasons to believe in God. We're going to look at God based on pure logical reasoning. This particular proof for God is called the moral argument. And Christians have actually used it to defend the existence of God for over 1,000 years. Now, it works like this. Right and wrong exist if and only if God exists. Right and wrong exists, therefore God exists. So right off the bat, we can see that clearly if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 has to be true. Therefore, the question we need to look at is, are 1 and 2 true? If they are, then 3 has to be true. To sum up the gist of this argument, it's basically saying that if there is no God, then there's no such thing as good and evil. God determines what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is evil. Since we know that some things are good and some things are evil, like it's evil to kill little children, that's clearly evil, and it's good to not do that, then therefore there has to be a God. There must be a being who is the ultimate moral lawgiver. This being is the basis for what it really means to be good in the first place. There are a lot of ways that people try to poke holes in this argument for God's existence. And while all of them have answers, we can't deal with each one in this video. Instead, we'll need to look at the one that's most popular with teenagers. Please understand that if I don't address your question, that doesn't mean there is no answer for you, especially if you actually look for one. In its very essence, the idea that there is such a thing as good and evil means that there's someone who says what is good and what is evil. I mean, can you imagine a rock laying on the ground? Does that rock care about what's right and what's wrong? Does that rock have desires at all? Of course not. Obviously, it takes a being, some sort of personal entity, to have desires. Things like rocks, for example, they just don't do that. But if there's such a thing as right and wrong, then we need to ask, what being says so. In other words, says who? Who says that's wrong? Who decides what is good and what is evil? Clearly there has to be a who, but who's the who, right? Well, maybe it's just people. Maybe human societies and cultures just make up their own ideas about it. Maybe people just make it up, and it's not God that makes it up. It's just this group of people over here, makes up theirs, and this group of people over here makes up theirs. I mean, who decides really? Well, let's take a trip back, and let's imagine back to World War II. In World War II, the Nazis, they were racist against Jews, and to the point that they slaughtered 6 million Jews. The Nazis believed that they were doing a good thing by doing that. They formed a society that believed in that. That believed that racism against Jews was good. It didn't matter to the Nazis if a Jewish person had been caught doing anything wrong. It only mattered that the person was Jewish. And that was enough reason to kill that person. So they rounded up. They literally rounded up as many as they could, got them together, and killed them by the millions, literally, in only a short span of years. The Allies, on the other hand, were the opponents of the Nazis in this war. The Allies were a collection of other nations, and they believed what the Nazis did was evil. The Allies fought the biggest war they've all ever fought to stop the Nazis. They spent their time and their money and gave their lives to stop the Nazis. So here's the question for us. Who's right? Who's right? Are the Nazis right and racism is good? Or are the Allies right and racism is evil? And please understand this point very carefully. As soon as you take a side and choose the Nazis or the Allies, then we have to ask, who says who? Who decides that one side is right and the other side's wrong? In other words, if you go around saying that human societies create the rules of good and evil, then what happens when human societies are so different and disagree? If you believe the Nazis were truly wrong, says who? If they are wrong just because you say so, then do you decide what is right for everyone? If you decide what is right for everyone, then doesn't that make you God? The key to understand here is that if there is no being, if there is no person, no moral lawgiver who is the basis for good and evil, then there is no such thing as good and evil. Good and evil don't happen on their own. Rocks don't dream it up. It comes from a being that has a desire for what is good and what is evil. And for those rules to apply over and above everyone everywhere, then that being has to be the ultimate being. So if there's no God, then everything becomes ridiculous. You would logically need to say that something very evil, like can you imagine something very evil, like someone who actually, there are people out there who murder innocent children. Those people do exist. The Nazis were some of those people. But those people exist today. I'm sad to say, but they do exist. Are you willing to say that murdering innocent children is no better or worse, and no different, really, than loving and taking care of an innocent child? Now, there are many people in the world that don't believe in God. They're called atheists. And in my experience, for the most part, they're good people. Just because someone doesn't believe in God, it doesn't mean that they don't believe in good and evil. But the point we want to make here to you today is that it makes no sense for you to have one without the other. You can believe in good and evil all you want to and not believe in God all you want to. You can do that, and that's your right. But you could also believe that the bills at your house just get paid and also think that nobody pays them. You can believe that. It just makes no sense. Most atheists I've met, they're good people. They're trustworthy people. But the point I want to make as clear as possible is that the belief in good and evil and the lack of a belief in God, they just don't logically fit together. It's like believing that you will pass a class you never study for. It's like believing that someone who makes straight A's never studies. It just makes no sense. Now, if you're with us at this point, I want to thank you for following along, because we have covered everything I wanted to share with you in this video. I hope we made you more interested in this and interested in reading and listening to what others have to say on these issues. We've only scratched the surface. And for anyone who doesn't believe that Christianity is true or that God exists, I strongly recommend reconsidering that for obvious reasons. Does what you believe really make sense? Is it always important whether or not what you believe makes sense? Thank you for your time.